Billy, I want to come back to you. Um, I mean, I've worked in an NGO, and sometimes you're stretched. You're trying to do good. You're trying to save the world. You're trying to deliver water, healthcare, and these things matter, right? So you say compliance is for the Safaricoms, the MTNs, the Dangote's company. Why should it matter for that two-woman NGO in Accra? Why does it matter that NGOs should focus on compliance as compared to their core mission?
Good questions, Salome. And when you ask that question, I see three things. Firstly, and you mentioned Safaricom and the corporates, but it makes good business sense. Now, I know we are non-for-profit and the likes, but like you said, NGOs are trying to do good things. They're trying to change the world and the likes. But they have to ensure that the value that they're distributing actually reaches the actual people, the actual communities that really needs it. So I think there's a personal responsibility on the leaders to do the right thing. Aisha mentioned financial control. You can't achieve good financial control if you don't have a good, solid, effective compliance program. That's essential. The second thing that's really important, and I mentioned this, is to comply with regulations, whether it's international or local. You have to comply. You can't be investigated and sanctioned all the time by the relevant regulators in whichever jurisdiction it finds application. And then last but not least, I think for NGOs, reputation is key. I mean, we know what Warren Buffett said about reputation. It takes you a long time to build it, and you can really lose it in one transaction. So because of the fact that NGOs are queuing for funding, I think the reputation and actually all three of these aspects are playing a vital role and are critically important. And those are the reasons why we have to have a solid compliance program, taking all of this into consideration. Shalom.
I want to, sort of segue to you now, flipping everything. You could react to the points that Aisha has made, but also if you could shed some light on weighing up the costs of compliance versus the costs of non-compliance and what that would mean for an NGO.
Okay, and please let me know if you can't hear me clearly. I've tried to crank up the volume as much as I can, but I think being in Geneva is probably stretching the bandwidth. So for me, is the cost of compliance always worth it? The answer can sometimes be no, for a variety of reasons. For me, it comes down to risk versus reward, and what controls are you putting in place to mitigate those risks, and why are you trying to mitigate them? Compliance should always lean into supporting your mission and what you're trying to achieve. Often we see controls being layered upon layers of a new control. Something goes wrong, we add a new control. Something goes wrong, we add a new control. We add more compliance, more compliance, more compliance. And we forget about the cost of that compliance. And it's quite often, and it's something I've seen in many organizations I've worked with, where you have so many controls, you lose your ability to be agile and to respond to the communities you're meant to be serving. And things like procurement, which should be done quickly in the case of an emergency, suddenly takes 6 weeks because it needs 14 signatures. I think it's critical that we review our compliance frameworks against the risks they're trying to mitigate. Now, there's always going to be some hard red lines, like legal compliance, be it employment law, accounting regulations that we have to meet. Then a lot of compliance frameworks are around how do we ensure our operations are successful. And it's important to look at how do we make those compliance frameworks as effective and efficient as possible. One of the key options is digitization of controls, which removes people from the process and makes it a lot easier and less burdensome. So I always support NGOs in looking at how you reflect on how to further adapt your control framework. Then the other side of the argument is it worth just simply not complying with donor regulations or donor requirements, even if they are laborious, and hope they don't find out? So I saw a question in the chat, especially about the grassroots NGOs struggling to meet international donor compliance officer requirements. As a former international donor compliance officer of sorts, I completely agree. The problem is NGOs often sign up for those regulations saying they can meet those standards. I would always encourage NGOs to say, we don't have capacity to meet these demands. Can you fund us as part of the agreement to build capacity? And that is often something many international donors will support because they've got an agenda to grow their NGO base. But I think, as Willie said, if you have a lot of non-compliance and it comes to light, your reputation can be significantly impacted, which can have a devastating effect on an NGO. If I look at some of the cases that have been reported publicly, we had Goal, which failed to comply with a large set of its procurement regulations due to essentially an inside fraudster corrupting the system. Huge amount of funding suddenly paused, reputation very badly damaged with one of their key donors, and huge staffing restructuring issues. You had Oxfam, who were at the height of the SEAH abuse scandal, and I think if you've seen the press recently, they've come back under fire for having similar issues in DRC. And again, their reputation is damaged, not just with their main donors, as in their governmental donors, but also with those who support them at a local level, so they're personal donors. And they've lost a huge amount of funding. And outside the NGO sphere slightly, but there was Adam Smith International, who basically failed to have a culture of compliance and doing the right thing at the very top of the organization, which led to a complete break of trust with DFID, who was at that point, I think, supplied 80% of their funding. The effect of that was funding being frozen, the organization having to downscale, make about 250 redundancies, and significantly shift their portfolio globally. So the cost of non-compliance can be huge. And a reputation takes years to build, but seconds to lose. So I think there's two sides there to sum up. You need to understand the risks that you're trying to mitigate and build an effective compliance framework that always adds value. And it goes to the question I saw in the chat about building a culture of compliance. It needs to be ingrained in your culture. Your team needs to be on board to support the values, and I'm sure we can answer those questions later. But at the same time, your senior leadership needs to recognize that if you don't comply, you sign up to agreements that you're not complying with, you're setting yourself up for significant scrutiny and potentially reputational damaging issues that could almost sink an NGO, especially a small one. I'm happy to take any questions later about that. Cheers.